Hello, class, and welcome to another lecture. Today I have Hosea 8 through 14, and I'm Josh Starr, if you did not know. So, I just went last week, and so I don't think I need to spend too much time explaining how I've laid out the PowerPoint. The only difference you'll notice is that because of some really specific issues in this section, there's some words that are very difficult to nail down. Even the commentators just express that this is just a difficult section. I've dedicated a lot of the grammar and syntax slides to working through what the commentators, how they work through the issues. And so that's really the only difference. So let's go ahead and get into it. Like before, I just want to read through the entire passage, showing you kind of where my breakdowns are with it. But let's go ahead and get into it. So, starting from the top, Israel has been swallowed up. They are now amongst the nations, like a worthless vessel. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey. Ephraim is wandering alone by himself. They have given love gifts, for they have given also amongst the nations. Now I will gather them. The king and commanders will be weakened soon from oppression. For Ephraim multiplied altars to sin. They were to him altars to sin. I will write to him multitudes of my law. Like a strange thing it is regarded. My sacrificial gifts they are sacrificing, and they ate flesh. The Lord does not take pleasure in it. Now he will remember their iniquity, and will punish their sin. To Egypt they will return. So Israel forgot his maker and built palaces, and Judah multiplied fortified cities. And I will send fire to his cities, and she will eat her fortresses. Alright, so starting with verse 8. Nivla Yisrael, Ata Hayu Bagoim, Kikli Ein Chefetz Bo. Israel has been swallowed up. They are now amongst the nations like a worthless vessel. So only two verbs. First is nivla, nifal, perfect, third masculine singular from bala. And then hayu, cow perfect, third common plural from haya. There's only one textual problem, which is very nice. Trust me, when we get into the next few verses, you'll see why I'm happy about this. And it actually refers to the textual note 9, and so we're going to hold off. So nothing for right now. And like I said, a lot of this presentation is going to be focused on the grammar and translation notes, or the grammar and syntax notes, because of some of the really interesting interpretive and textual problems that are in this section. So the first, just to start off, is to talk about the domino effect. Anderson Friedman, which I have just put as AF, they use this term twice in different places in their commentary. They never define it. So I did some sleuthing, and the only reference I found to this in Hebrew, and in biblical Hebrew and textual criticism, and any of it, was the idea of a verbal connection between two sections containing different content. And so if you'll look at verse 7, I don't have it on the slide because it's not part of my section. It includes the term bala, as well, which is to swallow, and it refers to it in swallowing fruit. And so this word, if I'm understanding the domino effect and how Anderson Friedman uses it, it's almost a springboard to lead to a different topic. Not entirely different, but what's related between the two sections is more the use of the verb than the intention, right? The context of it. And so that's what I understand the domino effect to be. But if you have another understanding, or you know what it means, please tell me, because in general, I really did not know. And the resources that I looked up were pretty sparse on what that could mean. What I think that we can conclude, regardless of what this term means, is that 8 really is woven as almost a hinge between what came before and what comes after. It's related to 7 because of Bala, but it is also separate as it uses Bala in a different way. In verse 7, someone is swallowing the fruits of the land, I believe, but in verse 8, it is Israel who is swallowed. So let's actually talk about Bala for a little bit. So Harper, just to let you know, I'll be using Anderson Friedman, Harper, Mackintosh, and the tiniest bit of Calvin to kind of interact with this text and interact with the different ways others have interacted with the text. Harper is really fantastic for his way of laying out all of the interpretive options and the textual options. Mackintosh is really in connection with early Hebrew scholarship, and so he just really ties it into how did medieval Hebrew scholars and how did Masoretes and how did all of these people we know, how did they connect these terms? And then Anderson Friedman is just a really good commentary. But before we go on, I do want to give you a little note on Anderson Friedman. So in this section, which I've already told you, it's very difficult and there's a lot of problems, Anderson Friedman decides to completely restructure the text. That means that they're going to draw different lines. You see how this is one line, this is another, and then there's a space, and there's another line. They're going to draw completely different lines that almost to the undiscerning looks arbitrary. And so that means that they're going to take different nouns for different verbs. They're going to bring things to refer back to things. In general, I am not going to side with Anderson Friedman in this section, and that's because theirs is the least conservative translation. Theirs is the least conservative decisions, and this is kind of the sticking point for me, is to accept one of their textual interpretations and textual solutions really in a lot of ways relies on you accepting all of them, and I just could not accept all of it. So if you're looking for a discussion topic, maybe tell me how you felt about Anderson Friedman's use of this chapter. I know it's not required reading until a week or two in the future, but if you have read it, just let me know what you thought. I'll bring up throughout the presentation some of the things Anderson Friedman says, but I wanted to say it at the beginning because I will not focus on them like I'm focusing on Mackintosh and Harper. So with that very large introduction to the commentaries, let's go ahead and look at what they say. So Harper, how does he interpret swallowed up? Well, he says it's practically ruined. So it's this like state of like, I guess ruin is a really good word for it. And Mackintosh, he cites, like he does throughout his commentary, some Hebrew scholarship, and he says that some of the rabbis, I believe in this section he's talking about a medieval scholar specifically, connects it with vitiation, decay, and undermining destruction. And so what he goes with is lost from view. Both Harper and Mackintosh are going to affirm this is not a prophetic perfect, and so it's not total. So this isn't Israel being like wiped out. Instead, this is Israel being swallowed in a way that's not entirely destructive. And so I have a problem with Harper's is that practically ruined is not, it seems too total for this if it's not supposed to be read as a destruction. And my problem with Mackintosh is that lost from view is something an English reader would instantly understand about the term swallowed up. And so I think that if we just translate it exactly as the text has it, English readers will get the gist of damage or at least mild destruction. It's clearly a negative term, and it certainly an English reader would get that they are obscured or lost or absorbed. They would understand that, and so I actually just translate it straight as swallowed up. I just thought this was interesting. Mackintosh says that we could actually interpret this in bagoim, the bait preposition. I'm interpreting it locatively, so if that's a word, in a locative way, that where is Ephraim, and certainly where are they a vessel that is useless, amongst the nations is where they are. Macintosh, I think he actually does translate it this way, but he suggests that it's possible to translate it as a bait of instrumentation. And so, why are the, or through what means are the Israelites a useless vessel? Through the nations, through whatever interaction is going to be described, through this interaction with the nations, Israel has become a useless vessel. Now, you might have noticed, just even by looking at the screen right now, that that's a whole lot of words to translate as just simply useless vessel, especially since there's a there is no right here. So, kikli ein chafetz bo actually means there is, like a vessel, there is no pleasure in him. So what does that mean? Well, in Jeremiah 22:28 and 48:38, the context that we get is this idea of a defective, useless, and I think this is maybe how Jeremiah 22:28 uses it, as a unclean pot. And in 48:38, it's thrown away. And so I think we get this idea like something is wrong with this vessel. And Macintosh, I think, gives us great help by pointing out that Proverbs 3:15 and 8:11 use this terminology, not in the exact same way. Jeremiah, it's the exact same way. Proverbs 3:15 and 8:11 tie these terms with worthiness or worth. And so this is why I've translated it as I did, as like a worthless vessel. So what does Israel become? A useless or a worthless, a pot or a vessel without any worth amongst the nations. And we're going to see that amongst the nations may be the central point for most of this passage. And so this is essentially the judgment, the verdict of a lot that's about to happen. So let's go ahead and get to it. For they have gone up to Assyria. Oh, sorry, let me get the Hebrew first. Ki hema alu, Asher, Pere, Boded, Lo, Ephraim, Tithnu, Ahavim. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey. Ephraim is wandering alone by himself. They have given love gifts. So parsing, we have cow perfect third common plural from Allah. Then we have bodeth, which is a cow participle masculine singular of badad. And then we have hithnu, which is going to be a big deal. And so I put it in red because this is a major thing, and it's also repeated in the next verse. It's a hifil perfect third common plural from Tana. Just a word on how I'm translating this. Allah, I'm translating as go up. That is the base meaning. There is some difficulty because go up often refers to height, and yet that doesn't seem to be the case for Assyria, where they're going, Assur, because Assyria is flatlands, according to, I believe, Anderson Friedman references this. They say that Alu could also mean to go north, and that's probably the case. I think that the gist of what is to be understood, the meaning behind the words, is clearly revealed, even if we translate it merely as to go up. And it's just a cow perfect third common plural, so they go up is great. They went up. I actually think it's a action that is continuing throughout the past and into the present, and so I just translate it as just to make sure they have gone up to Assyria. Excuse me. Badad is an interesting verb you may have encountered when you translate this. I don't know if you're translating as with me or reading an Anderson, but either way, when you translate this, you'll notice that it has the understanding of perhaps wandering or perhaps being a straggler, somebody who's who isn't with the group. And interesting, lo right here, to him or for him. And so essentially it's a wild donkey, pere, bodeith, something about being alone. It really is a verb that carries the idea of being alone, but maybe a little bit more than that. And then to himself. And so the way I translated it is the way that I saw many commentators did, and I really took my lead from them, is pere, a wild donkey, bodeith, it's a participle, so try and translate it in a way that has this continuing action, and so he's wandering alone. And then a lot of people left this out. I think, why not include it? It's to himself or for himself. I said by himself, because that is essentially the gist of to himself, I believe, in the way it's being used right here. They also pointed out that pere and Ephraim are similar, and there might be a little bit of a rhyme scheme there to really tie in that Ephraim is being referred to here. I'm going to go ahead and leave out talking about Hithnu because that's going to be the topic of the next 2 slides. All right, so here's the textual problems. Remember that I said in 8 that there was a reference to 9a, and that's right here. Perhaps transpose after text note A in verse 8. I will admit to you, I have no idea why they're doing this. None of the commentaries really talk about why BHS suggests this. I would love to hear why you think that this is being done. I don't know if we could really defend it, but I really would be interested to hear your theories on why. Because, so the way it's read right now, let's just read it. For they have gone up to Assyria, a wild donkey Ephraim is wandering alone by himself, they have given love gifts. This is what they would like you to say. Israel has been swallowed up, a wild donkey, he is wandering alone by himself, they are now amongst the nations. So it flows, they are now amongst the nations, so he's wandering alone by himself, and now he's amongst the nations. But it could also tie right into, for they've gone up to Assyria, so he's wandering alone. And so I really don't know why this is being suggested. If you have a theory, or if you know, then please let us know. Secondly is B, and that's tied to, like I said, Hithnu. This is going to be a big topic of discussion. Is it has been proposed that Hithnu, which some have translated as they have hired. I shouldn't have put it like this because some have translated it this way. It's still difficult to understand even what this word would mean if it's left as it is. Should be translated as, or probably originally was, Natanu, which is, or not new, I guess is what it would be, which is they have given. So Hithnu, not new, or not new. That is actually, and so you may have noticed from last week that I pretty much rejected every single textual suggestion from the BHS. I'm going to break that by saying that I think this is a very valid assertion. This is one of the, in my opinion, one of the only ways to make sense of the text, because Hithnu has a great deal of problems in itself. So I actually, in my translation, like you saw, let me go back, they have given love gifts. I went ahead and accepted that, which is rare for me, and I don't usually like it, especially if there's no textual witnesses. But to me, this is the route that allows the text to have a meaning that is in line with context. So let's look at some grammar notes and really translation notes. I really enjoyed how one of the commentators mentioned that Hosea progresses in specificity. So Israel was swallowed, they're now among the nations, and now they're going to Assyria. So it's just this very narrowing down, and it's almost its own judgment, right? It's very clear that none of these are said in a very positive tone. So translating Hithnu, and just a note for your discussions, I know sometimes it can be hard to generate a lot of discussion when you're just watching a video. Whenever you see in bold translating blank, I think that's a great opportunity for you to let me know what you think about the word, how it's translated, or even to let me know how you feel or think about the commentators, because they do not, in my opinion, handle it with equal precision and skill. I think sometimes they do, with these words, take a less likely route. And let me know if you agree with me, because I don't always agree with all three of these or even one of them. So the first translation problem we have, and it's really a textual criticism problem as well, is hithnu. So Anderson Friedman translates it as they have hired. So if you've read the text, you'll know that. And the reason why is they align this term with etna and etnan. So hithnu is aligned with etna and etnan, which is in Hosea 2:14 and 9:1, which would be Tana, and it is they, and these two terms certainly or very likely are related to hiring. But hithnu is a hapax legomena, and so that is where the problem comes in, is this is not the same exactly as these two. Harper translates as they have given following, he translates it as, sorry, there's no quotation marks in this one, they have given following the BHS textual criticism note. I'm going to follow Harper on this one. I think you should read his explanation, because I think he helpfully goes through the text. And if you don't have it, you actually do. If you're a student of Southeastern and you're using your Southeastern email for Logos, Logos has now given you an abundance of resources for free for the next 60 days, including Harper's commentary and Mackintosh's and Calvin's. And so I would really recommend you, for a few of these things, I'm going to tell you to consult Harper and consult Mackintosh, and just know that you can do that through Logos. So that's a little plug for Logos that I didn't intend, but hopefully it'll be helpful for you if you didn't know about the 60 days of abundant resources. And so I think Harper's translation here, just getting back to the text, is very helpful. And I think that you should, that it would be worth your while to read how he comes to his conclusion. Mackintosh, and we're going to see this a lot on the Testimony of Early Hebrew Scholars, translates as they are full. And the reason he does so, and this is interesting, is that some of the earlier Hebrew scholars, they understood to give Natan, so he's actually using Natan as well. They understood it as when it's in context of marriage and specifically lovemaking and love affairs, they understood that Natan carried the weight of celebration and rejoicing, either in the woman or the love itself. And so he understands this as they are full. And what I want you to note when it comes to the next word that might be a little bit challenging, ahavim, which is a plural of what appears to be the noun love, is that many of the decisions, my decision included, have less to do with how to translate ahavim and much more to do with what you do with hithnu. So it's not at random that each one of these lines up with their translation of this. So Anderson Friedman, they have hired. Did they hire love gifts? Certainly not. Did they hire love affairs? No. But of course they hired lovers. Harper says they have given. Did they give lovers? No. Did they give a love affair? No. Did they give love gifts? Yes. And Mackintosh, they are full. Are they full of lovers? No. Are they full of love gifts? No. They are full in their love affair. So they are rejoicing, or they are delighting in their love affair. We're going to see this word, natan, or hithnu. It's going to be in a different stem, but it'll be the same word. Each of these guys are going to stay the course with what they've chosen. So Anderson Friedman's going to stay with they have hired. Harper's going to stay with they have given. Macintosh is going to stay with they are full, but he's going to actually change the wording. I believe he changes it to they celebrate, or they are, I think it's they celebrate, but it might be they appreciate. But they're going to essentially stay the course, and I will too. I'll stay with Harper and translate it as they have given. So, the next one is verse 10. Gam ki yithnu, there's that hithnu is now yithnu. Begoim ata akbatsem. Vayachelu ma'at masa melech sarim. For they have given also amongst the nations. Now I will gather them. The king and commanders will be weakened soon from oppression. So again, I put in red that that's the same word as in the verse prior that gave us so much trouble. So yithnu is now a kal imperfect third masculine plural from Tana. Akab same is PL imperfect from first common singular of kavatz. And then we have vayachelu, which is hifil imperfect third masculine plural. So just as Tana is actually not the root that I believe it comes from, so too is halal not the root that I believe that this comes from. And so we will get to that, just a teaser trailer. We'll get to that in 2 slides. So, all right, let's go ahead and get into the textual problems. First is on Yithnu, no surprise. It has been proposed with several manuscripts that Yithnu, they have hired, again, which is possible, is Natnu, they have given. And so what are the several manuscripts? Well, it doesn't list them, which is not my favorite. I would like to know if it's Septuagint, Targums, or if it's just a fragment manuscript, full or what have you. But all we know is that in non means several. So there are a decent amount of witnesses that say that this actually should be they have given. Next, B, anytime I see a question mark, it makes me a little bit hesitant. So they're saying the verb akabseim, which is difficult to pronounce, may be corrupt, and it has been proposed that it should be they shall be scattered, which is afitseim. You might wonder, why do they suggest this? Note that there's no witnesses, that there is a question mark. Why are they suggesting this? And I think that what we can see is that this is the suggestion here is really related to how kavatz is a positive term. So Rashi, and I believe I put it here. No, I think I did bring it out, sorry. But so Rashi does believe, and quite a few of the earlier Hebrew scholars that Macintosh will refer to did believe that kavatz is a positive only term, and some modern commentators have held it, none of the ones that I cite here. And so what's the problem with that is that this is clearly a judgment. This is a burden. They are going to maybe grow weak, maybe be wounded, maybe be pierced, maybe be something else. It's not a positive term. This is clearly judgment. And so they say it would make sense that if this is a judgment and pairing it with what's going to come later, that they're going to be returned to Egypt, that instead of being gathered, something that is often in the Hebrew Bible, something good, God's going to bring them back from the land. Back to the land. Instead, they shall be scattered from the land. I would reject that on the grounds that kavatz does not have to be a positive term. Most of the commentators that I cite here would agree with me. And also, I think it's a stretch to replace kavatz entirely with afitzem. I don't think that that's something that would be easily done. So next is C to C, so that's Vayachelu Ma'at Mimasha, or Massa, sorry. The probable reading is, and they will cease soon from anointing. So I'm going to go into this in detail in the next slide, but I don't really cover this, and so I want to. So essentially what they're proposing is that Masha, which is a burden, should actually be Mashak, which is the Mimashak, which would be the pronoun. Not the pronoun, the participle from anointing or to anointing. And so they're also going to use this as cease instead of wounded or weak or anything else, which, like I said, I'll cover. But just to point out, the Hebrew, the BHS is suggesting that this should be to anoint instead of burden, which it is in the text. And finally, the reading with many manuscripts and commanders. So we're going to cover this briefly in the next slide, but just to let you know, Melech Sarim, this is not in construct. There is no Vav. So essentially what this says is king princes. What we can say is that it's possible, according to all of these manuscripts, so we have Vulgate, we have manuscripts, we have the Targum, we have Septuagint, and we have Peshitta. What we have is either Melech with Vav, so Melech Vasarim, or we have in Greek Kai. And so they're proposing that we should read it as and commanders, because that's how clearly many witnesses did translate it. So this is a lot, I know, but it is worth going into. First is just merely to address Gam Ki, which is a rare form. We don't see these two together very often. So Harper translates it as also if, which is actually present in 9:16, Isaiah 1:15, and Psalm 23:4. Mackintosh, which I believe he's translating this the very traditional way, the way that many have, is yet though. And Anderson goes ahead and translates it as indeed, which I thought was interesting. They really do smooth out these two in a way that does not relate as well with either of them by themselves. I, as you could see, kind of go with, I believe, Harper. Yeah, Harper, by translating it as for, which is to honor that key. They have given also, which is to honor that gam. The problem is that I don't know if it is proper grammar to allow the gam to be, I don't know if modifying is the right word, but related that way with the verb, especially since it is at the very beginning of the sentence. Maybe you can shed some light on that, or at least on your translation. But for me, for they have given also amongst the nations seemed like the best use of what we have before us. Next is Vayachelu. Harper offers 3 options. Again, Harper is a fantastic resource, if just for the fact that he almost always lists all of the options really clearly. So Harper offers 3 options. The first is halal, which is to begin, and you might have seen that was when I used Logos to help to check my work on the parsing. They said halal should be the root for this. Hul, which is to grieve or be in pain, or hadal, which is to cease. So Mackintosh states that the MT understands it to be halal, which is again what both Logos and Harper and my own decision got us to, which would be and they began. Rashi holds hul, and MI, which sometimes I'll use as Mackintosh, holds hala, which is to be weak, which is interesting that Harper doesn't even mention this option, especially since it really could be the case, especially with what we have here. So let's just look at the translations. Harper's translation is they will cease, which is hadal. soon from the anointing of kings and princes. I left out the of, my bad. So Harper translates it as cease. And one point that he and Macintosh make is if you're going to translate it as cease, you might as well go ahead and translate and allow the textual criticism note and go to anointing instead of burden, because they will cease soon from the burden of the kings and princes does not make as much sense, especially in a judgment passage, which it clearly is. Macintosh goes with hawa, which is they shall soon show weakness because of the oppression, which is it's a little bit of a stretch on the word burden, but I think it has precedence and it is allowed. And so I actually went with oppression as well. Anderson Friedman they were contorted in pain a little while ago, with hul being the root that they're assuming. They do some fancy footwork with Nahum and with Joel, but I think it has some problems. Especially, they even admit that to bring in this word in the meaning that it has in those two passages, and along with the modifiers that it has in those two passages, might be a stretch. They go ahead and do it, and I think that they give some more explanation because of it, so I would suggest that you refer to Anderson Friedman. I was not convinced by their arguments. Calvin, this is the only time I reference Calvin, but his commentary was just a kind of a refresher because it's written in a little bit more accessible language than the others. They shall grieve a little for the burden of the king and princes. So he's obviously going with hul as well. Sorry, that I just noticed that is a hey. It should be a chait. So, again, anytime you see translating blank, I would love to know your thoughts. This is a really good one for you to look at on your own, because there's quite a few elements to examine. So there's not really any witness that says to do anything new with it. And so some of the arguments I saw were based on the root actually being the correct conjugation of these roots. So I would suggest that you take some time and maybe even write in your notes for the discussion how you're going to translate this, what root you're going to use, how are you going to align it with the context, meaning are you going to translate it anointing, are you going to translate this as soon, or maybe in a little while, and then how does the root that you think is valid relate to the conjugation that we have, vayachelu. All right, so let's move on. This is just a interesting note: is why is God gathering His people? Remember that excuse me, that some, like Rashi and a few others, thought that gathering could not be a negative thing, and so both Harper and Macintosh give a explanation. Macintosh just merely says that they're being gathered together to be judged all together, and I think that's helpful, but Harper gives a very interesting explanation. So just as the donkey is wandering, just as they're amongst the nations, just as they go up to Assyria, so now he's going to gather them in. So the sin is in one direction, the judgment is in another. So they're going to be cut off from the nations, and then judged by the nations. And so that's Harper's explanation. I don't know if it fits the context perfectly, but it is a really interesting way of thinking about things, especially the reversal of the sin's direction is interesting to me. And last, Melech Zarim, I think most of you will agree with Harper and Anderson. It's an ascendedon, which is just these two belong together, and they essentially have an implied and in there. Macintosh, he actually translates it as a title for the Assyrian king. He translates it as king of princes. So here's his logic, and follow my little mouse. The king of princes was a rendering of king of kings, a title for the Assyrian king, just like in Ezekiel 26:7, king of kings is a title for Babylonian king. My problem with this is that and again, I'm just going to work my way backwards, is This is not the Babylonian king, and it does not have a connection to Assyria. It has a connection to the Babylonian king, and it's not even King of Kings. And probably the major problem is it's not in contract either. It's not King of Princes, it's King Princes. And so I would reject Macintosh's because of it's kind of a stretch in logic. All right, so verse 11. Ki hirba Ephraim mitzbakoth lacto hayu lo mitzbakoth lacto. For Ephraim multiplied altars for sinning. They were to him altars for sinning. You can just look at the English and tell that there's going to be some problems with this. This just looks weird. There's odd repetition that does not seem to belong. It doesn't make the point any more clear. And you would be right if you had those problems, because this is an area where our commentators are going to disagree. All right, so let's start our parsing. Hirba is Hifil perfect, third common plural from Ravav. Lacto is Cal infinitive construct from kato or kata plus a lamed. And hayu is Cal perfect third common plural of haya. And then we have lacto repeated again. So you might notice that this is in red. That's because Ravav, which is to multiply, to be great, to be many, is going to play a serious role in the next two verses. Actually, in the next three. So let's go ahead and look at our textual problems. The first being on A, which is lacto hayu lo. What the text does, what the BHS editors are suggesting is to connect this with what follows. So the altars have become sin for him. They're taking it away from right here. So draw a line right here. And then just go ahead and look at B to B. So the Septuagint does this. It divides this, and then it deletes B to B. So to read it, so if you'll look at mine, the way I'm translating is, just if you'll follow my mouse, I think it might be helpful. For Ephraim multiplied altars of sinning, they were to him altars of sinning. What the Septuagint is suggesting is, for Ephraim multiplied altars, draw that line right there, for they were to him sinning. They were to him sin. If you'll note, they have turned this into a noun. Locate, not lacto. So the second occurrence to sin is eliminated, and then they say connect this to what follows. So we'll have to look till verse 12 to see what it's actually connecting to him. So just some translating notes is lacto. What does Harper do with it? Harper says something so strong and a little bit bold. I was actually very surprised to see him take this stance. Harper states that to retain in sinning of the first line involves a repetition amounting to tautology and greatly weakens instead of strengthening the sense. Now, I throughout have really enjoyed Harper's commentary and actually have agreed with him on so many points, but I want you to note, and this is helpful because of textual criticism, this is helpful for us as we're deciding what texts mean, is that what he's actually arguing for is that it isn't a good argument. It isn't an impressive or emphatic literary use. He argues that it is simply a bad repetition. Now he also says it might amount to tautology, and that's another thing, but I think that we would be right, especially trying to get to the be faithful to the text, that this is not a great reason to delete it. There might be other ones, but certainly simply because it isn't emphatic enough or it weakens instead of strengthens, is not a great reason for it. In general, I've really enjoyed Harper's. That just stuck out to me, and maybe you'd want to comment on what you think Harper's getting at, or if you think he's valid. I certainly struggle to see this is a valid reason. Next, we have Macintosh inverts the phrase, and what Macintosh does is really interesting because he makes the sentence make a lot of sense without removing any of the words, without really changing much of the meaning that is clear from the text, clear from the words, by simply inverting it. So the way I read it, just to repeat to you, is for Ephraim multiplies altars for sinning. To him, they are altars of sinning. By just inverting it, he had already altars of sinning, which again, I'm not exactly sure where he gets that when and had. You know what? Sorry, I do know. This is what he's saying is, there were to him altars of sinning. Note that is hayu, which is third common plural, so therefore matching with mitzbakoth. And so they were to him, or there was to him, altars of sinning. Then, but he's using ki in a comparative sense. I don't know if that's exactly what you would call it, but it is interesting that he's using it that way. Hereby, Ephraim multiplied altars to sinning. So essentially what he's arguing is that this is a judgment because Ephraim the people of Israel had altars on which their fathers had sinned, and they weren't content with that amount of sin. Ephraim multiplied altars to sin. They're getting worse. They're doubling. They're going much more into the rebellious religion that they've already embraced and their fathers have embraced. While Harper really doubts in sinning a lot, Macintosh supports it by saying that altars to rebel is actually in the exact same framework, right, as misbekoth lacto in Joshua 22:16. So maybe look that up. I think that's helpful to compare. Anderson Friedman, I told you they're going to be maybe miles away from the other commentaries on quite a few points. This is one, is because of the way that they divide up the text. Like I said, they're going to draw lines in very different ways. They have herba without a subject, and so they translate it without the subject as he speaks arrogantly, which is a very kind of interesting choice. This is not typically what Ravav would mean, and it does not seem to mean it here, but they argue that in 1 Samuel 2:3 it does mean that, and so it may mean that here. Next is verse 12. I will write to him I forgot to read the Hebrew again, sorry. Ektav lo ruvev torati kamo zar nekshavu. I will write to him multitudes of my law, like a strange thing it is regarded. The parsing is ektav, which you might want to note that is not normal. That it essentially is ektavva. There's a bait there. It's a Callan perfect first common singular from katav. And then we have nekshavu, which is nifal perfect third common plural from hashav. Some textual problems to note is the first one is A to A, which would be ruvev torati, is probable reading is the abundance, greatness of my laws. So what they translated it as is rov torotai, sorry. And then simply what they're pointing out in B is to look at the ketiv, which is they're saying is revo. So I'm going to leave the discussion of ruvev to its own slide, which should be a warning to you that it gets a little complicated. I love what Harper says is each word presents difficulties Harper is very honest about how difficult some of these verses are. So first, translation note for ektav. Harper is really questioning, and it's interesting, not many of the commentators really addressed what appears to be a vav and a bait, which makes me think that there might be a solution there that I'm missing. So it says right here, obviously, ektav as a solution, but there might be something. That's the K-ray, by the way, is ektav. I'm going to go ahead and hold to that because it seemed like universally every commentator did. They didn't even, in many cases, address that there's a kativ kere right there. They just went ahead for it. So Harper's note isn't even on this. What it's on is how we translate it. So what we have here is, like I said, a cal imperfect first common singular. So I will or I am. And Harper says, if the author had intended past or present perfect, he would have used the perfect tense. So he's arguing that it does not mean I write or I wrote. The hypothetical force seems to be preferable for Harper. It could be changed to a hiphil. I would say no, it can't. There's not really any evidence that it should be a hiphil. Or it could be a historical present. A present perfect, a future, a past, an imperfect of a customary action or hypothetical. And Harper sets it up to be a hypothetical. I actually really enjoyed reading about Harper's work through this. I would suggest you do. What Harper ends up on is a hypothetical. And while for this presentation, my goal was to translate it as literally as possible and then only smooth out what must be smoothed out, I may change this in my own translation just for personal use, because I do think the hypothetical carries the force of what the sentence appears to be saying. It's not that God will literally write to Israel multitudes of his law, and then they're going to regard it as something strange. I think much better understanding is, if I were to write to him multitudes of my law, he would regard it as a strange thing. That's the judgment. This is a assessment of Israel. And so I would honestly most likely suggest to you that you consider or embrace the hypothetical here. Czar is interesting because everybody translates it different. Anderson Friedman translates it very different, as they have been wont to in this section. So Harper translates it as those of a stranger are regarded. And so essentially what he's saying is that Czar is a strange thing or a strange one. The way I translated it, just to remind you, is strange thing. So the law itself is a thing that is strange as it's regarded. Harper says it's a strange one. And what kind of one? A person. So a stranger. So as a strangers would be regarded. And so what this means is that when God writes his law to his people, or if God were to write his law to his people, it would be regarded if it came from a strange land. So a stranger from somewhere really far from Israel comes and brings their law and seeks to impose it upon them. That is how Israel is regarding their own God's rule and law. Mackintosh translates it as someone, who? Some God. And so in a very similar way, just only mildly different, is instead of a stranger's law from their land, it is the God of that land's law. So Israel regards the law of Yahweh, their own God, in the same way that they would regard the Babylonian or any random tribal deity's laws. That is how Mackintosh translates it, and it carries the weight of this passage very well. It's almost the same. It ends with the same meaning as Harper's. And Anderson Friedman, again, because they cut the lines in very different ways, this is very separate. It's not really as connected as before. And so like blank, they are considered. Who is they? It's not the law. It is the king and princes. And so what does it mean to be strange? It means to be pagans. I will not say too much on that topic because I'm not convinced by it. And again, you would have to accept all of their, or at least most of their line redistributions, and I would not do that. So I tried to give you a pun. I don't know if it came through, but multitudes of difficulty with Ruvev, which means possibly multitudes. What we have here is Ruvev. We have a Ketiv and we have a Kere. So what is written down is Ruvev. There are a few suggestions for what the Kere. Well, actually, the Kere is essentially known, but there's a few suggestions for what the Ketiv could be. So MI means Macintosh, and H means Harper. Ketiv is a cow third common plural of Ravav, to be great or many. Remember, I put in red just to remind you now that we have seen Ravav before, and we will see it again in verse 14. And so, is it possible that Ketiv is another Ravav, a cow third common plural, to be great or many? And so what would that look like if we're going to take away the vowels? It would look like Revo. Not Revo. Ravu. So Ketiv could also be the construct noun Revo, meaning myriads, or 10,000 things. So myriads is how Macintosh translates it. Harper gives both myriads or 10,000 things. Ketiv could be rove or ravoth, meaning multitudes. And then Ketiv could also be dibre, which is the words in construct. And Harper suggests all of these because Harper, like I said, is really good at suggesting, giving us all the options and then working through them. If you only look at one part of Harper's commentary, this is where you should. That he lists quite a few options, and then he also, we're going to cover this, but he goes through why he doesn't agree with 3 of them. And I think that was very helpful. So let me just go over the options one more time because I want to help you understand this. And this is a lot of text here. Is one option is Ravav, meaning to be great or many. Another option is Revo, which means myriads or 10,000 things. Another option is Rove, which means multitudes. And the last option is Dibre, which means the words. So that's the Ketiv. The Kere is Ruve, which appears to be a construct plural noun of rove. The Kere could also be rendered as multitudes or many or excellencies or great things. And so the decision you have to make is what is this word supposed to be? Well, for Macintosh, he actually decides on Ravav, and I think that that's a valid way to decide because it is in 2 other verses in near proximity. Anderson Friedman decides that Hirba, which is Ravav, is the right way to go, and so he actually translates it as it's interesting, he translates it as a noun being used as a cognate accusative, but based on, so he's using rebo. So construct noun, meaning myriads or 10,000 things. And then Harper decides on rebo as well. And I'd like to just work for just a second through the 3 objections Harper has to the other options. So Ruve as a plural occurs nowhere else. So just maintaining Ruve, which is the Kere, it would be a hapax legomena, and it's unlikely that it would be used here. The next is nothing is gained by substituting Ravav, since they all convey the same idea. He essentially is saying that Ravav is the most of a stretch. It's the least likely of the others. It requires the most change. and for very little payoff, considering Ravav and Rivo and all of these really do share the same meaning. And so a less likely change for very little payout is not worth it, according to Harper. And then last is, it is impossible to imagine that Dibre would be in the text and then removed. And I would have to agree with him there. My solution is Rebo, just as Harper's is. So I translate it as multitudes. Actually, I've translated it as multitudes. I think that was actually a mistype, just to let you know. I did originally agree with Revo, which is myriads or 10,000 things. So that's just a mistype. What it should say is myriads. I will write to him myriads of my law, or I will write to him in the 10,000s of my law. Sorry about that. Sometimes it slips my attention with these PowerPoints when you have a lot to type. The next verse, and we're getting close to the end. I wish I could tell you that it's much easier now, but it is not. My sacrificial gifts they are sacrificing, and they ate flesh. The Lord does not take pleasure in it. Now he will remember their iniquity and will punish their sin. To Egypt they will return. The Hebrew text is Zibhai, Habhavai, Yizbaku, Basar, Vayokelu, Adonai lo Ratsam, Ata, Yizkor, Avonam, Vayifkod, Hatotam, Hema, Mitzrayim, Yeshuvu. The parsing, and there's quite a lot of verbs here, is for Yizbaku, cal imperfect, third masculine plural from Zavak. Vayokelu, cal imperfect, third masculine plural from Akal. Ratsam, which is a cal perfect, third masculine singular from Ratzah. Yizkor, which is a cal imperfect, third masculine singular from Zaker. Yifkod, which is a cal imperfect, third masculine singular from Pakad. And Yashuvu, which is a cal imperfect, third masculine plural from Shuv, which has been a word that I've seen come up a few times in Hosea. It's been interesting to see this come up and how it's been used. So you might notice there's an abundance of textual problems. So the first one has to do with Zibke, Havai, Yizbaku. So what it is saying is it should be read as sacrifices they loved and they will sacrifice. So consider the Septuagint. I found it interesting that the Septuagint refers to the altars as well-loved altars, and so it's possible that this is in line with the Septuagint here, though it isn't marked. I'm not sure about that, but it was interesting to me that this is related in theme in a way that doesn't always come through with this text, especially with the difficulty in discerning what this word means. The next one, Adonai lo Ratzam, is they suggested to delete it because it's a gloss. And so what they're saying is, let's go back to my translation. So my sacrificial gifts they are sacrificing, and they ate flesh. The Lord does not take pleasure in it. What the editors are saying is that the Lord does not take pleasure in it. It was not original. What it is a commentary. It's a gloss. It's an explanation of these two lines. So the sacrificial gifts they are sacrificing, and they ate flesh. Well, is this just normal sacrifice? Is this just normal ritual? No, the Lord does not take pleasure in it. Two things we can handle at once are the suggestion of translating as Ezkor and Ve'efkod. And the reason why is because the Lord was the speaker in verse 12, and now the Lord is a subject. I mean, he's a third person. And so what they're saying is that if this is just a gloss, that Adonai lo Ratzam, if that's just a gloss, then the he here also doesn't make sense. It should be I. This is, the Lord is still speaking. I don't think we have to. I think that several of the commentaries I read point out that often in prophetic language, and even sometimes in the Psalms, we see the first person speaking of the Lord turn into a formal third person, and yet the Lord is still understood to be speaking. And so I would suggest that that is what's happening here, is that the Lord is speaking in third person. And I think that there's quite a lot of text to back that up too. The last thing is perhaps added later. What they're suggesting is that from Avonam all the way to Yashuvu was added later instead of original. Next, so looking at have havai, which is a difficult one to understand. Harper goes with sacrificial gifts. This was actually what Logos also fell into the decision of. Mackintosh, again going back to those early Hebrew scribes and scholars, many scholars, well actually I don't know if I would say many, but several scholars pointed to this being a word related to the understanding or the concept of speed. And so Mackintosh translates it as frequent. And then Anderson Friedman translates it as loved ones, seeing ahav in there. I went with sacrificial gifts. I think it makes sense with the context because what's not disputed is the sacrifice and sacrificing. And I think that while frequent is a nice translation, it doesn't even have as much relationship with speed as he seems to give credit to. And it does not seem like they are sacrificing loved ones of the Lord. It would be my loved ones, and I don't know if that lines up with what's happening here. The significance of the return to Egypt is also an important point, especially since the BHS are suggesting it would be added later because of the terminology. And so what we have is the question about, is it past or present? Is it a prophecy? And if so, is it literal or is it figurative? So just to look at Anderson Friedman first, they actually take the position that they have returned to Egypt. It's a past thing. And the way that they refer to it is they are seeking alliances with Egypt and Assyria. So Anderson Friedman makes a very bold statement that I must admit I was kind of shocked about, is they say, if this is a prophecy, it is one that never came to pass. And so, I mean, in reading that, immediately we come to this understanding that they assume that it must be a literal captivity in Egypt. So let's look at that. Harper states that this is either a figurative reference to exile or a prediction of captivity in Egypt. And he lists many places where a captivity or an exile or returning to Egypt takes place: 9:3, 6, 11:15, Isaiah 7:18, Isaiah 11:11, and Micah 7:12. He actually states this as a support for why it might be a literal captivity in Egypt. My problem with that is just because it is repeated often does not determine that it's literal. Mackintosh posits that God will either reverse his classical saving event, or this is a more literal punishment of exile in Egypt. Now, for my interpretation, I think that Mackintosh states it wonderfully. God is reversing his classical saving event. Throughout the Pentateuch specifically, but beyond the Pentateuch, throughout the Hebrew Bible, God is known to his people as the God who brought them out of Egypt. Excuse me, the path was from Egypt to the Promised Land. It was the idea that God was the savior of the Israelites from bondage and slavery. And Jeremiah, even in his classic reference to them abandoning God and going to broken cisterns, mentions that how could they have forgotten that he brought them out of Egypt. And so I think classical saving event is a great way of referring to this. Egypt was the exodus, and now the return to Egypt is a figurative reference to the exile. So they've gone from Egypt to the promised land, and now from the promised land to Egypt. And so I would assume, and this is my interpretation, is that this is referring to Assyria, and then possibly, if we were to expand the scope of what return to Egypt could mean in different contexts, to exile in general. Lastly, we have maybe my favorite verse of this section. So Israel forgot his maker and built palaces, and Judah multiplied fortified cities. And I will send fire to his cities, and she will eat her fortresses. So the parsing is... Actually, sorry, I didn't read the Hebrew. Vayishkak Yisrael et Oshehu Vayivin Hekaloth Vayehuda Hirba Arim Besuroth Vashilakti. I have had a lot of problems with that one. Vashilakti Aish Ba'ariv Va'akla Armnoteha. So now the parsing. Vayishkak, Cal imperfect, third masculine singular from Shakak. Oshehu is a Cal participle, masculine singular of Asa. Vayivin is Cal imperfect, third masculine singular from Bana. Hirba, and yes, that is the same Ravav of infamy from the previous verses, is a Hifil perfect, third masculine singular from Ravav. Vashilakti, told you I was having problems with that one. Vashilakti is a PL perfect, first common singular from Shalakt. And Va'akla is Cal perfect, third feminine singular from Akal. Some textual problems is interesting that they simply say the whole verse was added later. And the reason why they do that is they think that this is is that they think that this has nothing to do with what came before or what comes after. I'm going to argue in our central idea of the text section that this has everything to do with what has come before. The second part is unfortunately I have left you last week, and I'll leave you this week with something I don't understand. So translated in the Latin is others, and then I don't know what a gamma means, or only and Judah added they esteem. So if first off, I don't know what a gamma means, and Hab has different translations. I thought maybe they esteem. If you know what this means, please put it in the discussion so that I can learn. My book that I've been using to help me with the Latin, Old Testament Textual Criticism by Brotzman and Tully, which I would recommend if you don't have, by the way, they did not have a gamma, and so I don't know exactly what that means, so please help me out. And I actually am now noticing that I missed the C here, and so I can just translate perhaps, but I missed that. Let's see if it changes the text. It does. So instead of arm no teha, it is arm no tive. And so what we can conclude, and I don't know what said means. I'm sorry that I forgot to put this. I think I was overwhelmed by the a gamma. This is really clear. What it is getting at is his fortresses or his fortifications, not hers. And the problem is something that we're going to refer to on this slide. Who is she? So Va'akala, the she here is clearly Aish, fire. But Armnoteha, it is not clear who is the she who possesses these fortifications. And I'm going to, and this might be a happy way to end for us because of how often I've disagreed with them in this section. I'm going to agree with Anderson Friedman. They see this as the cities as a collective whole. So that requires also that they translate this as fortifications, not fortresses, which I'm okay with. And so what they're translating it as is her fortifications. So the fire burns the cities as a collective, their fortifications. Mackintosh translates it as the nation of Israel. The problem with that is Israel is rarely a she, especially not if it's in a literal sense, not a figurative sense, and it's not been a she in this section of Hosea, or I can't recall if it's been a she in Hosea beyond figurative uses. So regardless, it is essentially the same idea, is that the fire will burn Israel's fortresses. So, getting to the end, the central idea of the text is, if the people of God do not stand firm in faith in God's power and provision, they will not stand firm at all. Now, I'm not clever enough to come up with that. The ESV translation of Isaiah 7, Isaiah says to Ahaz, in a very similar way to what we've seen in this text, and especially in verse 14, Ahaz is trying to build the fences around the water supply, and Isaiah meets him and tells him and reminds him of God's power and provision. And he says, if you do not stand firm in faith, you will not stand at all. And so what I want to point out is that throughout this, Israel has been swallowed by their attempts at political protection through alliances. 8 through 10 highlight that. And they highlight it in almost mocking terms. So Ephraim is this wandering donkey, stubborn and alone. So even in their seeking out of nations and being amongst the nations, they're wandering alone. Not only that, they had compromised on their religious rights and had lost sight of God's provision and his law. So in 11:13 through 13a, what's being dealt with is that Israel is so consumed with a desire for protection, and yet they have abandoned the true sacrificial system and the true obedience to the law. They've added pagan, cultish ritual. They've added things that do not please the Lord. And then finally, they've relied on fortifications and defensive walls to keep them safe. And this is why I think 14 not only belongs, but is central, is that it is a very specific and very occasion-based reference to their reliance on other things to keep them protected. And what I find so amazing is that the God of Israel was able to protect them from anything, while nothing could protect them from him. Note the judgment. In verse 10, in verse 13, in verse 14, the Israelites are looking for protection. They're looking for protection, and God was able to protect them the whole time. And now God is going to prove that their protection is not enough to protect them from him. So God could protect Israel from the nations, but the nations can't protect Israel from God. God could protect Israel if they didn't have defensive walls and fortifications, but no fortifications and defensive walls can keep them safe from God himself. And so that's the amazing truth, is God is all powerful and he has chosen to protect us, but we see that nothing could keep us from him. Nothing could protect us from him if the occasion would arise for judgment. How do we apply this to Christ? It's a very judgment-based passage, and it's got a lot to do with looking to other foundations to protect us, to keep us safe, and I think stability is a big part of that. And so I would say that the first thing is that faith in Christ for salvation is an incredible comparison to what is being told to Israel. So essentially, nothing can protect you except for God, and nothing can protect you from God either. And so we trust that Christ's death and resurrection have given us salvation, and none of our works will support us if we lean upon them. Not only that, but even now, as Christians living in the world where there's a lot of instability, I mean, think about how quickly we've gone from meeting together in a classroom to staying in our homes in a state of emergency on a national level. Uh, in a way, we're so surrounded by instability right now, and always have been, even if we're not aware of it. But the people of God are marked by the assurance of hope that Christ will return and bring full restoration and judgment. So we rest in Christ's return, not in wealth or walls or our worthiness, to keep us stable and safe. We cannot lean on anything else. If we don't stand firm in faith, we won't stand at all. Just as Israel said, they assessed their condition and they said, we are lacking in protection. We must assess our condition and say we are never lacking in protection if we rely on Christ and long for his return and hope for his return. The general application is really in line with this is, are you attempting to find security and stability outside of Christ? This can be such a easy thing to get into and such a hard thing to notice, is we're leaning on Christ and other things. So the question to ask yourself is, are you relying on anything but Christ to keep you secure and stable? And then finally, is idolatry in your heart leading to unhealthy reliance on anything other than God? Well, I hope that this has been helpful to you. This study has been very helpful to me, especially in sharpening my textual criticism skills and even my grammar and syntax. I would encourage you, if you're looking for a difficult passage to challenge your Hebrew skills and to really sharpen your ability to judge what a passage says and make intelligent but confident decisions, I would say study this one pretty well and devote some special time to it. Thanks for listening and making it to the end. So I'm going to leave it here. I look forward to your discussion.